One of the consistent themes that we wanted to share across the board with you all during our summer blitz and beyond, right, is this whole notion of thinking about the whole child. And we know how very important it is to ground our work each and every day and thinking about each of our students in a holistic way, really thinking about if they're coming to school healthy and safe. Have they been allowed to be engaged in all of the learning that's happening? Are they being supported and challenged in different ways? And you can see certainly from this graphic that comes from the work around the whole child, there's a lot of ways that we try to embed learning about the whole child from different avenues. So, could go all the way from, something that's happening with employee wellness to support you supporting children, or maybe some community relationships that you've developed. There's numerous ways that we can help to support and work together as a network, right? And we would be remiss to not ground our work in that notion of looking to see what's best for the whole child. This is just a quote that was really resonating with a lot of folks, probably more so during the pandemic, but even now with some of the challenges that we face coming and starting a new school year, but really thinking about a child, the promotion of their social and their emotional and those academic pieces. We're not shifting to talk about all of those. Truly, that's what education is all about, wrapping all of that up together and supporting children. Okay, so today we are going to be thinking and closely and deeply about oral language. So we know that oral language actually kind of falls under this umbrella of foundational skills. Oftentimes we think of pre-kindergarten, maybe all the way to third grade, thinking about foundational skills and really being explicit about teaching those skills. So today we're going to really dive in deep and talk a little bit about what we mean by foundational skills first off, and then take a look at just one aspect of foundational skills, which is oral language. So we'll talk a little bit about the components of what we mean about oral language. Sure, you think of oral language and you think of talking, right? And certainly that is one part of it, but there's other pieces to it that we can kind of dig into a little bit and think about how we might explore our instruction to really stretch kids and think more about conversation in classrooms and developing those oral language skills. We're going to talk a little bit about instructional practices that help to promote oral language and conversation and literacy, certainly, of course. And then we are going to share some strategies about how you can support oral language in your classroom, whether it be in small groups or in your whole group instruction. So I would be remiss if I did not lean into our Michigan ELA standards when we think about foundational skills. I could have just dived right into thinking about strategies and practices that we think we could try in a classroom. But before we do that, it's really important that we go back to those standards because that really grounds us and lays the foundation for the teaching that happens as time goes on. A couple of key things I really wanted to point out here when we look at our standards, specifically our foundational skills in grades K through 5, we're noticing that it's really understanding a couple of different things when we think of foundational skills. Here they're stating concepts of print. So does a child know how to hold a book? Do they know how to turn pages in the correct way? Can they point to a beginning letter? Can they point to an ending word? Are they able to notice punctuation? All those kinds of things fall under concepts of print. The alphabetic principle, of course, knowing their letters, knowing sounds that go along with those letters, and other basic conventions of the writing system. But one other thing to really point out here is that foundational skills are not in an end of itself, right? It's rather where we want to go. It's a vehicle to get to what we need to get to. And so when we talk about all of these little pieces, ultimately we put them together to help us become proficient readers that can understand and comprehend text. I found this on the web. Oops. So just a couple of things to point out there. Another thing that I wanted to mention to you too is that good readers will need less practice with these foundational skills than struggling readers or striving readers. We may have to be more intentional and targeted with our foundational skills teaching with some students rather than all. So we would certainly not want to do some teaching or instruction around skills that kids already know. And I would be in that category of teaching things to children that they already were pretty competent in doing. So we really want to be mindful of differentiating that instruction in foundational skills. One other thing I wanted to share, and Cindy, if you wouldn't mind putting those standards link in the chat, as well as this one. This is a lovely little summary, and I like it because it is a summary. Sometimes when we dig into research, it feels very overwhelming and very dense. This is a summary of some deep research that was done. And this actually comes out of the Institute of Education Science. And what we find in this summary of research is some key things that really help to support reading and understanding in our youngest learners. What foundational skills do we really need to focus in on to help support them becoming proficient and fluent readers? And what I want to do is just share some key things with you from this summary. And certainly, if you have a little bit more time, you can dig into the article itself. But what they're saying is that there are 4 recommended practices that really need to be thought through. So number 1 is teaching students that academic language skills. And that means including like inferences and how narrative language is put together, as well as vocabulary. So you can think of a very common text that you might read to kids. Maybe it's a read aloud, but what we want to think about is teaching them the different words that they see in a text. Why is this academic language? Maybe it's deeper vocabulary coming from a content area. Or maybe when we talk about inferential language, maybe it's something that's just not laid out as easily to understand in reading. Thinking about narrative language and how we insert quotation marks and people talking with one another when characters are introduced to a story. So all of these things play into building those language skills. That's one key thing that they're recommending. Another one is really developing awareness about segmenting sounds of speech and how they link together to letters. So that often in your mind, you're probably thinking about phonics instruction, and that I would agree with you, along with a phonological awareness skills and practices that we can do. So kids are able to understand sounds within language and then how they can match that to letters and words. A third recommendation is teaching kids how to decode words, analyze word parts, and write and recognize words. So again, these are all things that we want to help support students in deepening foundational skills so they become proficient readers. And then lastly, of course, is ensuring that kids are reading text every single day to support their accuracy, their fluency, and their comprehension. Okay, so again, when we talk about foundational skills, it's laying that groundwork for our readers. And oftentimes we kind of go right to the very basics of phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. And this piece of research is telling us, let's look globally at it. And these were the 4 pieces that we really want to signal into. So today you'll notice that we'll really be focusing a lot in on number 1, because that really taps into that oral language. You might even see us tapping into a couple other ones too. We might be talking a little bit more about segmenting sounds. If you're joining me tomorrow, I'll be here and we're going to talk about phonological awareness. So I'm trying to break up these pieces of foundational skills so that we can really understand and be intentional with our teaching. So how does oral language support reading, right? I guess we kind of just think intuitively it does. It's kind of a natural organic thing. And what we need to understand is that it's a part of a system, right? The way we talk, our language, our way of speaking is part of a system. How we use our spoken words to talk about what it is we want to say and how to share ideas and talk about feelings. It's a way that we are communicating. And developing oral language means that we're really building on those skills and building on that knowledge so that we can have a conversation and we can do some listening and speaking along the way. And that's all helpful in building that solid foundation to be able to read and write and really understand. So it's a very beginning piece. Think about an adult learner who's learning a new language, right? They probably will learn best if they're hearing and practicing the sounds of how that language is spoken. And just the same holds true for our youngest learners. We need to really hone in on the beauty of the babble, I would say, right? We were just in a professional learning this morning and we talked about the buzz that was going on in the room. We talked about there can be a productive buzz, right? That means we're all engaged and we're on target with what we need to be talking about. And that certainly was evident this morning. So there are some components about oral language that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about. You'll see that there is some research out there from Dr. Moats from 2010. Some of you may have participated in letters training, and you may have heard that name. She's the person that has really founded the letters training and all the work that's gone along with it over the years. But oral language, according to Dr. Moats, is made up of 5 components. As I was doing research for our session today, really you can do a lot of digging into oral language, and ultimately researchers are really agreeing on these components across the board. So we see phonological skills, which we'll be really tapping into a lot tomorrow. We're going to be talking about the pragmatics of oral language, the syntax, the morphological skills of oral language, and semantics. So those might spark back some memories of college courses or some reading you've done along the way in a possible reading course or so. I think it's important for us to know what they are, but certainly it wouldn't go past an educator conversation. We wouldn't want to share with our parents necessarily some of these key terms. It might just go right beyond them. But if we're in our educational setting with teachers along the way, it's kind of important to kind of make sure we're understanding the language, just as we're asking kids to understand some academic language. We need to as well within our professions. All of these components of oral language are truly necessary so that we can have conversations and communicate through these conversations and spoken interactions. So we're going to go ahead and dive into each one of them. But again, another visual for you, maybe just to hold on to and ground that thinking, are those components of oral language. And as I mentioned to you, here's another, it's actually a diagram that comes from some other researchers that are talking deeply about oral language. And again, you'll see these components being mentioned again and again. And we're going to just go ahead and dig into each one so that we can kind of understand what they mean. So the first one we'll talk about is phonological skills. And what I like to say about phonological awareness or phonological skills is it can be done in the dark. Okay, you don't have to have a letter or a visual associated when you're talking about phonological awareness and skills, because it's only referring to the sounds. So you can close your eyes, you can be in a room that's dark. When you're practicing hearing sounds, that is what we're talking about when we say phonological awareness. It's the sounds of language, it's the syllables, it's the rhymes, it's the cadence. Phonological awareness is really the understanding of the sounds, or those little increment sounds. We call those phonemes. So it's understanding those separate phonemes and learning how to write and read and spell. And children need to be able to distinguish those tiny amounts of sounds so that they can connect them and attach them to letters. So when you hear about phonological awareness, remember, it could be done with your eyes closed. It's hearing, it's really distinguishing those finite sounds within language. So when we talk about oral language, we can also think about the component of pragmatics. And this really refers to kind of social rules of communication. Think about how we talk when we have a particular purpose. Certainly, I'm talking a little different to you today, right now, than I would when I would be talking to my children or my husband, depending on the setting and the purpose. How we communicate when we're engaging with a particular audience. Even our verbal cues go along with maybe our nonverbal cues as well. And it's really what we say when we find ourselves in particular situations, making sure we're following the right norms and conventions. And for those teachers that might be on today who are teachers of young children, you may recognize when they enter school, they're needing the support on how to interact in a classroom. It looks different than what it did when they were at home or in a daycare setting. So learning those norms and those conventions and how to interact with others and when is appropriate, and what expectations we have in a school setting. And certainly these signs differ across content areas, and they even differ across text genres. So always thinking about who's on the receiving end and how the communication is going. Now I'm just going to stop for a minute because this feels really awkward to me right now, because I'm just talking to these squares in a box. It would be much better if we were in a room together and we were having a communication that was back and forth. It feels very one-sided to me, and it feels like I'm not really following what I'm saying on the screen. But bear with me as we kind of hit through some of this. The next component within oral language is syntax. You may have heard of that one. And syntax really refers to understanding how our words are put together so they make sense, especially when we're writing or speaking and our words are following a certain flow. We would expect to hear a noun and then a verb. We would expect to have a connector and then maybe a prepositional phrase as we end our sentence. It's the way our structure is, it's the way our language is structured. And they're really focused on those rules, on how we put phrases together and how sentences come together. Again, as I said, thinking about the different parts of speech within a sentence and making sure that they follow a certain flow. Oftentimes when you're maybe sitting next to a child and observing them reading, you may be taking some notes or doing a running record, and you'll notice if a child has strong syntax or maybe needs a little more support in that syntax area. Oftentimes when we're dealing with English learners or multi-language learners, we notice that sometimes they will drop off a word from a sentence. It might not match the way their first language is organized. Sometimes you'll hear a multi-language user leave off an ED or an ING because they're still trying to navigate the organizational structure of our language. So it's important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about oral language and kids practicing in conversation. Another component is morphological skills. And this really refers to the smallest meaningful parts within words that help us to create meaning around that word. So we talk about root words. We talk about adding suffixes on or prefixes before that root word. It's really kind of understanding the meaning behind a prefix or a suffix, making sure it makes sense in our conversation and that it relays the meaning we're trying to get across. And ultimately, it's that relationship between that meaning and understanding what it is that we're reading or hearing from another person by deciphering what those words mean. So, for example, I could simply take the word do, and if I added a prefix re to it, a child would need to understand, what does redo mean, right? How is adding re to the root word do changing the meaning of what I'm asking? So it's important to be thinking about that when we're learning words, when we're conversing, when we're playing around with words, right? I do hope that even though today seems like I'm giving a lot of information, probably one of the key things we'll be missing today is a lot of play. You'll see some in some videos a little later on, but ultimately playing with words is how kids learn, right? And try to make it not necessarily so structured and focused, but we're playing with words. And I'll just make a quick little connection to that. Oftentimes we'll invite parents to say, hey, when you're in a car with a child, you might look at the sign McDonald's and then you say, McDonald's, McDonald's, and you're playing around with that letter M, and then you say, McDonald's. And then you might say, oh, French fries. And then you might say drenched fries, and you change that F to a D sound. That's what we mean by playing around with letters and sounds and words. Make it as fun as possible. Okay, the last component within oral language is semantics. And that specifically is focused on the purpose and the core of any language, right? It's all about the meaning of what the words and the phrases are saying and how you're going to communicate that effectively to others. Meaning is more than vocabulary. I loved it when they said that. Meaning is more than vocabulary. So it's not just understanding a particular word. How are these words clumped together to actually give us more of a meaning, of an understanding of the text? And vocabulary knowledge exists in multiple degrees. So again, thinking about how different words mean different things. And depending on the context of how those words are placed in our language, in a sentence, the way we're sharing, really helps to shape the meaning of that message. All right. So the next thing that we want to take a peek at are the literacy essentials. And I hope that our folks online today and ones that join later on in a recording have certainly heard or seen the literacy essentials. So these are documents that began to be created in 2016. And they started simply with a kindergarten through grade 3 literacy essentials document. That was the very first one. To date, it's 2022, we have from birth all the way through grade 12. So it's expanded tremendously in the last 6 years. Truly one of the major priorities of my job as a literacy consultant at Wayne Risa is to share these documents with each and every teacher that I can. Wayne County is our largest county in our state. And so we would be doing a really great job if we were able to get these documents into the hands of every teacher in the county of Wayne. It's collectively an initiative that's really helping to support the instruction of literacy across the board and leaning into 10 research practices that if we as a collective teachers unit within the state of Michigan lean into each and every day with every child in every classroom, we can make a significant difference in the lives of literacy across the board with our children. When you see the literacy essentials, you'll say, yeah, I do that. And you'll feel really good about yourselves. I remember seeing them the first time and thinking, oh my, where has the state been? We know this stuff. And until I really started hearing from researchers and learning from other teachers in the field, I realized I wasn't doing everything as great as I thought I was, right? And I'll give you a quick example. One of the essentials focuses heavily on vocabulary instruction. And as I reflect back into my classroom days as a teacher, I would say that I probably wasn't as strong of a vocabulary teacher as I could have been. There were strategies that weren't really taught to me and I didn't know. I knew vocabulary was important, but there were ways about doing vocabulary instruction that I wasn't as intentional about. For example, like a read aloud, if I was going to read aloud to a child that day and hadn't prepared some vocabulary instruction prior to that read aloud, I really wasn't being as explicit as I could have been if I had pre-planned some words that might be new to children and really just insert a child-friendly definition as I was reading to them. I've learned a lot of tips and tricks along the way. So I encourage you to go to literacyessentials.org. Cindy can place that link in the chat as well. There are some really valuable tools. Other than the documents, there's some beautiful modules that go along with them and videos. And we're actually going to dig into a couple of them this afternoon. So something I wanted to be really clear about was I figured knowing the title of a session, foundational skills and thinking about oral language, I was thinking we might have some pre-K teachers today, and then also maybe some K3 or 4, 5. And what I really wanted to do is dive in deep to the pre-K essentials, which is the first document you see, and the K3. And the reason I really honed in on those is because you see oral language over and over and over again, hammering hard on oral language in very creative ways. One essential isn't dedicated to oral language. It actually comes through in multiple essentials. So in our pre-kindergarten essentials document, you will see oral language coming through with dramatic play, interactive read alouds, playing with sounds, and extended conversation. Makes perfect sense, right? It's when kids are talking, teachers are supporting that talk. This is when you're going to really lift up that oral language during these practices throughout your day. So if you're in a pre-K classroom and you've got maybe some dramatic play center areas, you can really lift up oral language during the conversations and during that play time. Maybe you're doing a read aloud, right? And you can purposely pause throughout that read aloud to ask really probing questions and have kids turn and talk to one another. What do you think about that? Where do you think things might go after this? It's being intentional about providing time kids to talk. Specifically in our K3 essentials document, you'll see essentials 1, 2, 4, and 7 really coming through that oral language piece. Again, it's not dedicated to just one essential because you're seeing it over and over and over again throughout our day. I will say real quickly, I am a literacy consultant, but with our literacy essentials, the intention is that literacy happens throughout the entire day. So if I'm in the midst of a math lesson, how might I insert oral language into that math lesson? The idea is that we're doing it each and every day, throughout the day. So it's not just during my literacy block that I can teach oral language. I can also uplift oral language in the middle of a math lesson. All right, so I'm going to show a brief video. I think it's about a 5-minute video. It's a snippet from this pre-K teacher, and she's going to be showing and talking a little bit about what dramatic play looks like in her classroom. And just a question for reflection is to think about how oral language can be encouraged through this intentional use of dramatic play. And you're going to see her actually be involved in building oral language development as the teacher. But think about other ways that you might insert that as well.
What do you think this is? Food. It's a cookbook, and it helps the cook make delicious food. And he uses a thing called a recipe to help him with the ingredients, how to make a taco or how to make pancakes. How to make a quesadilla. And how to make a quesadilla. We're going to have menus and order taking pads and cooks and chefs, tablecloths, flowers, aprons, menus, pencils, order taking. Those are things they're really going to see when they go to restaurants. So that's why we put real life material in the dramatic play. So you want to always scaffold them by adding more material every week in there and based on their idea. So if somebody says, hey, I went to the restaurant and I went with my family and I got tacos, you try to build on that by asking them, where did you go? You know, who went? What did you do? What did you see? And that's how we slowly start adding material in at different areas. Warren.
You said you were dying. The first one.
The restaurant.
The restaurant. Okay, you can go. Warren, will you put these in the restaurant?
In the menu.
Will you take these over there and put these in the restaurant? Where are you going to start, Alasia? At the restaurant? Go ahead.
Go ahead. You can go. Sure. Start cooking some food.
The restaurant, Lazaro, I'll meet you over there in a minute, okay? It's really important to have literacy materials put out for children in all areas. It's really important because they learn by looking at it. They learn by utilizing it. They learn by having it available all the time. Here's pencils so you can take some orders from me. I'll be a customer. I'll be a customer.
I want some pancakes.
You want pancakes?
Yeah.
Let's look on the menu and see what kind of pancakes they have. Do you think they have pancakes on this menu? We have other, let's see, we have other menus.
I want this one and that one.
You want that one and this one? Look at this one. You might be able to find pancakes on that.
You get it.
We have all different kinds of menus here. Hi, what would you like?
I want some that one and that one and that one.
We'll write that down so we can give that to somebody and maybe the cook can make it for us. You want all that, Lazara? Are you hungry today?
What you want to do?
I'll take a salad. What do you have on your menu? Can I see the front of it so I can choose? I'll take chicken with ranch.
Chicken and ranch.
Yep, chicken and ranch. You want to circle that? You got a pencil? What would you like me to write? Food? What kind of food do you want? Pick something and I'll write it down. We have made it a post office because they want to mail letters. So we have a mailbox, or we'll make mailboxes. We have stamps and we have envelopes and writing material. We've done pet store where we brought in stuffed animals and turned it into like a pet store. And we also do the doctor's office where we bring in the doctor's office stuff, and they have their little babies that they take their temperature and they do their little blood pressure. We have actually all that in doctor equipment. I'll take tacos if you have them, Aliana.
Yep.
Okay. So hopefully you enjoyed that little snippet of some great learning happening in a pre-K classroom. But you think about oral language and how that was being offered up as a developmental practice, right? And teacher asking questions, kids asking questions to one another. really engaged in literacy by conversation through reading and through writing. So great examples there. We can't underestimate that playtime.
What?
So another thing just to think through, when we talk about oral language, it's hard not to really think about phonological awareness, because it's ultimately the words that we're saying and the sounds that we're making. When we talk about phonological awareness, we kind of think of that as that umbrella. And I think that's why I appreciate the graphics with those umbrellas. And all those little pieces underneath that umbrella really fall under phonological awareness. So when you see all of those things, you're really remembering, other than the one that says words and sentences, you're really seeing and actually knowing that this is an oral activity, right? It's really identifying individual sounds, being able to segment those sounds or blend those sounds, add sounds to them. And so we think about lifting up phonological awareness by digging into each of these pieces. A lot of early elementary teachers will do work around syllables and counting out how many syllables there are in words. Lots of rhyme and repetition with nursery rhymes or poetry. Some folks do work on onsets and rhymes, the beginning of a word and that onset, and then how it ends. A lot of times we call those word families. So just thinking about all these different ways of isolating and identifying sounds within language. It goes along with the oral language, and I would be remiss not to share that with you. So another thing to consider is those rhymes and rhythms of language. And again, we talked about adding joy to this kind of work. And so you think about singing songs with your students, reading nursery rhymes or clapping along with songs or raps. These are all really joyful ways of practicing oral language and help to support kids hearing sounds, hearing how words come together, those cadences and rhythms of sounds. Another thing that I wanted to share with you is the second video. It's about an 8-minute clip, and I think it's really worthwhile. We do have time for that. This is a great example of showing what we mean when we say pragmatics in language, right? Making sure we're getting cues from our social setting, depending on the setting or scenario we're in, maybe who our audience is. This is an example of a kindergarten teacher working closely with her group of children. And you'll notice a lot of different things that she's doing. One thing I wanted you to kind of just keep an eye out for is how she's supporting kids to be successful in their conversations. Again, you might have a group of 25 5-year-olds sitting in a circle. How do we manage that, right? And she's quite a master. I do want to mention that both of these teachers from these videos are from Michigan. They are part of our modules within the Literacy Essentials. So that's another plug to the state of Michigan, right? So enjoy this. This is a lovely example of conversation with little ones.
Read-alouds involving higher order discussion among children and their teacher before, during, and after reading support comprehension. In this classroom, the class will be discussing a book they read earlier in the day.
Me, Jane, tells a story of the scientist Jane Goodall, and it introduces students to her as a young child and teaches them about her dream of becoming a scientist and moving to Africa and studying animals in the wild. So when teaching them how to have a text-based discussion around a book, I typically start by reading the book. I tell them what the focus is for the book, and then I stop at certain stopping points and ask an open-ended question such as, what was Jane's dream? And then once I have one student answer, I typically like to ask who can add on to that or encourage them to go back in the book and pull evidence from the book. I often implement turn-in talks where I might ask an open-ended question and have them turn and share with a friend. And then after everyone has had a chance to share their thoughts, we turn back as a whole group and they get to hear everyone's answers as a whole group. Since we were revisiting the book, I decided this time that I was just going to show them the cover, remind them what the book was about, and tell them that today I wanted to focus on the author's purpose. Why did the author write this book? What did he want us to know about Jane? So put your eyes up here. Last Friday, we read this book titled Me, Jane by Patrick McDonnell. And this was a biography that Patrick McDonnell wrote about Jane Goodall. So we learned that Jane Goodall was a scientist who studied chimpanzees and the environment. So today I'd like us to have a discussion about what information Patrick McDonnell wanted us to learn about Jane Goodall. Before we start talking about that, we have our sentence stems up here. Can you put your eyes over by the sentence stems? And we use sentence stems to have a discussion with each other. So I'm going to read the first one just as a reminder. Can you repeat it after me so they're stuck in your brain? Can you say more?
Can you say more?
What do you mean by that?
What do you mean by that?
Can you help me understand?
Can you help me understand?
I agree with you because.
I agree with you because.
I disagree because.
I disagree because.
An example from the book is.
An example from the book is.
So when you're having a discussion today about what Patrick McDonnell wanted to teach us about Jane Goodall, we're going to ask that you use some of these sentence stems to talk with each other. Some ways that I prompt for discussion and keep discussion going are with sentence stems. I might say, can you show me an example of this? Or who can add on to that? Or who agrees with so-and-so? So, raise your hand if you can share one thing you think the author wanted us to learn about Jane Goodall. What is one thing, Cleo, that we learned about Jane Goodall in this book, Me, Jane?
Jane Goodall likes monkeys.
Jane Goodall likes monkeys. Jane Goodall likes chimpanzees. Who can add on to that? Louis?
She liked to have some animals, and she wanted to be like a jungle watcher for chimpanzees.
She wanted to look and watch chimpanzees in the jungle. Ashlyn?
She helps them live in their habitats because they're almost extinct.
We learned from the nonfiction book we read that chimpanzees are endangered. So Jane Goodall helps keep them safe in their habitats. Caroline?
She sat in a chicken coop for 4 hours waiting for a chicken to lay his egg.
Let's look at that example from the book. Caroline shared that Jane sat in a chicken coop for 4 hours waiting for the eggs to hatch.
Okay, so that's just a little snippet. I guess I didn't include the whole 8 minutes. But it's a nice snippet of showing how you can provide opportunities for kids to have conversations around a read aloud. So clearly they read this book a day or two prior, and they're just talking a little bit about what they learned. And she had those sentence stems to help children bounce ideas off of one another. You know, adults can do that pretty well, but children need to be taught that. So having some sentence stems, even on an anchor chart like she had, is a really good reminder to say, oh, I heard Julio and I'd like to add on to what he said, or I have a question for you. So it's really interesting to see where kindergartners can do this kind of work and then how it can grow over time. So we would expect that to go up a little bit more if we're talking about a 3rd grade classroom, or even with our older kids, they can build on to the community of talk in their classroom. So when we talk about conventions of language, there's a lot of things that go into it. And there's a lot of things that sometimes as teachers we might take for granted. I would say that elementary teachers are really masters at their trade because they don't take many things for granted. A lot of things need to be taught really explicit, especially with our young ones. But how to take turns when having a conversation and how not to blurt. That was actually a challenge in the midst of the pandemic, and people were learning how to mute and unmute and share, and audio wasn't working with us so great. So we had to kind of relearn how to take turns in a virtual setting. But teaching children how to be able to do that in a masterful way follows along with pragmatics, right? It's what's appropriate and how do we tackle conversations with a big group. There's a lot of other options here. Looking at the speaker is really a polite thing to do. It allows that person talking to know that you're listening. Responding to the topic of the speaker, or signaling a change like, oh, I really understand what Dr. Wade shared, but I was thinking this as she shared that. Getting a turn in a polite way, right? Getting a chance to insert your thinking in an appropriate way, using thank you and you're welcome. Again, building on one another's conversation. The teacher was trying to show that when she said, so who can add on to their thinking? So just really important ways of teaching kids how to maneuver through conversations and taking one small piece at a time, right? Taking turns could take a long time to master. So each one of these bullets really could take you throughout the entire year as you practice and focus on specific things. All right. Some of you may have seen graphics that look very similar to this. The reason I wanted to share it with you is because you remembered back at the beginning of our time together, there's a lot of research behind building vocabulary amongst our students when they're coming to school. And this is the study that has been done showing that there truly is an enormous gap when children are entering into school. And depending on how much language have they been a part of before entering into school. And what we're finding is that by the age of 3, many children that come from low-income families are exposed to 30 million fewer words. And sometimes you might hear that research stated as the 30 million word gap. And this is something that we're really digging into. There's a lot of great initiatives that are happening with our earliest learners. What I found really interesting is that it's not just about our kids entering into school or our young ones. Certainly that's very important. And we want to lift children's vocabulary from the time they're born and continue onward. Here's actually a little graphic that talks about the different income groups and then the age of children in months. So you can see it's going all the way to 4 years old here. But there's quite a span, there's quite a gap here between the words that have been addressed to a child from a child in a welfare setting versus a child who may have parents maybe that are professionals. So that 30 million word gap is real. And it's so important for us as educators to allow time to build that oral language, especially if they're coming in with fewer opportunities to do that. But one of the things that I found really surprising here is that word gap isn't just affecting our youngest learners. This is actually showing our secondary students as well. So kids entering into the middle school setting are still showing a huge word gap. You can see that going to 43%. So what can we do as educators to really minimize that gap? Because we do see children each and every day. Oftentimes the consistency of having a classroom teacher is so important and huge to those students. How can we make this word gap even less? What kinds of things can we do as educators to promote oral language so that they're exposed to more and more words, and we can lessen that gap with students in the secondary settings? So vocabulary development is huge, right? This session is not on vocabulary development, but just as we talked about phonological awareness, I would be remiss not to mention some things about building vocabulary. So really thinking about learning a lot more than words. You may reflect upon your educational experiences and looking up definitions in dictionaries. No more of that these days. I don't even know if people have dictionaries in their classroom, but it's a much more. It's about being intentional. Just as I shared the example of a read aloud and being pre-planned and prepared before that read aloud to maybe pinpoint just a few key terms that you really would like to highlight. Within those modules in Literacy Essentials, there's some lovely examples of how teachers masterfully just insert child-friendly language in the midst of their reading. They don't stop and have a big long lesson. They just simply state what that word means in a few words to keep the flow of the story going. And what we've learned from research that makes a huge difference that we spend the time pinpointing those terms and explaining what it is that they mean. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but knowing that reading aloud is such an effective way to build vocabulary, it's one of the key ways of building vocabulary. And so if you feel like you've read aloud too many times in the day to children, rethink that and read one more time before the end of the day. The more you read aloud and the more they hear your fluent reading voice, the more they'll build their vocabulary. Sharing poetry with kids can also enhance vocabulary and really expose them to some lovely words that are very creative and magical that you might not always see in some other text that they're reading from. And this is kind of interesting. Children should be adding about 5 to 10 words to their working vocabulary every day. So kind of interesting to think about really building that vocabulary if you were intentional with that. Now, doesn't mean we're going to put each one of those words on a word wall and say, yeah, we've gotten to 5 today, but it's intentionally making a move to adding more vocabulary and speaking to children so that they are understanding more and more words. And of course, vocabulary instruction should be embedded in meaningful conversations. Ultimately, we would like those kids to be using the same words they're learning in their personal conversations. So we're going to wrap up. And these are some key learnings from our day. And just a way to reflect upon your own instructional practices and what you might be able to do to really lift them. So oral language plays a really important part in our children's literacy development. Oral language has 5 components that it's made up of. So we talked about each one of those, and all of those parts are necessary so that we can communicate and have conversations in an effective way. And we know that children's language continues to expand as they interact with more and more people, and they learn about different ways to respond. We're key pieces in that puzzle, teaching kids about learning to interact and converse with each other. And a vocabulary refers to the words that children use and understand in their oral language, and we want to continue to build on that. And incorporating those essential practices into your daily routines will certainly help your students' oral language. And ultimately, it will increase their literacy achievement and their skills when we make an intentional effort on building those oral language skills. So hopefully you learned a few things today. And if you certainly have any questions, please reach out to me. My email is on that front page, and you'll be receiving this slideshow and any opportunities to get back in here and check out another piece of something that I mentioned, you're welcome to. I know a few people asked a question in the chat, and if you wouldn't mind just repeating that question and putting it in an email, I'd be happy to respond to you. And thanks so much for joining us today. Hope you have a great afternoon.